Salam Allah. All right, inshallah, we're going to start in just 1 minute, guys. Alaikum salam. How you doing, man? Good to see you. Jazakallah khair. Yep. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Brothers and sisters, Jazakumullahu khairan for joining us. This is the Tafseerah program. We study the tafsir of the program and also the seerah, hence the word tafsirah. We study the Quran in the order of its revelation. And now we are on the Meccan period, the Madani period. We've finished the Meccan period, alhamdulillah. And we've covered in the Madani period thus far Surah Al-Mutaffifin, which was the introductory surah. And it was mostly revealed during the journey of Hijrah itself. And then we took like about 1.5 years to cover Surah Al-Baqarah. That was, a bit of a journey in and of itself. And alhamdulillah, we started Surah Al-Anfal. I was pleasantly surprised actually because one of the brothers was asking me, so it took you 10 years to do like the Meccan Quran, probably going to take you another 10 years to cover the Madani Quran. Madani surahs are obviously much longer. We still have like, Surah Al-Imran, we still have Surah Al-Tawbah, Al-Nisa, Al-An'am, and all of those, sure. But I also discovered that we only have 25 surahs left. In the Quran. So inshallah, I think it'll take less than 10 years. I think maybe 5-7 years, inshallah, before we finish. But maybe that will be that sadaqah jariyah, that if make dua for me that if I left absolutely nothing else, then perhaps I left these notes right here, which alhamdulillah are more important to me than the videos, by the way. We're going live almost every session, but it's the notes really that matter, because I can maybe at some point, if I worked on those notes, it can become publishable material, or maybe posthumously, after I'm gone from the world, someone takes these notes and maybe works on them. So that will inshallah become, perhaps nur in the grave. It'll become sadaqah jariyah, sooner or later. We're all, it's all in Allah's hands, right? So, the idea of death does not particularly frighten me. Not that I'm ready for it, but I look at it as transformation. I look at it as transition. And so one of the things that you want to do, just to be ready for the notion of being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to always ask yourself every day, what am I leaving in the world behind that would benefit others? What kind of sadaqah jariyah? And I don't talk about the Western notion of legacy, by the way, because we have to be careful. Westerners, when they say legacy, they usually mean like wealth, like they leaving like some living trust or some company or whatever that their kids. It's all financial stuff, all material stuff. What I mean is what we leave behind as far as sadaqah jariyah, something that will benefit humanity. Ilmun yanfa'u nas, a knowledge that will benefit people. Or perhaps we've raised really, really good children that will continue to make dua for us and do amazing things. Or maybe we've sponsored scholars, we've invested in hospitals or think tanks or schools or masajid. There's got to be something. You got to leave something, that will inspire the world, that will make some random person look at an object and they say, may Allah bless the person that made this. Even if they don't know who you are or what your name was, your name is not on the wall, nothing, but you're not forgotten. Because people will see the actions and the things that you've left and they say, oh, may Allah bless this person. So you're in your grave and then there's some difficulty and then suddenly it lights up because someone prayed for you. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we all leave sadaqah jariyah behind, before we leave this world. And we continue with our discussion on Surah Al-Anfal, the spoils of war or the booties of war. It is the surah of quwwah, the surah of power. It's the surah that details the conditions of fighting for us, and when to fight, and when to use violence, when to use force, when to use coercive measures. We're not just talking about violence, by the way. We're not talking about war, shooting people. We're talking about force in general. When do I use coercive or forceful measures? And Surah Al-Anfal teaches us that we as Muslims only fight in order to protect ideals. We fight to protect principles and values, right? We don't fight for wealth. We don't fight for glory. We don't fight for territory. We only fight to defend values and principles, to protect the innocent, to come to the aid of the weak, and to remove the obstacles that stand in the path of the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reaching the hearts of people. Right? And this is why we fight. And in order to achieve this, the most effective, as I've said repeatedly, the most effective way of using force is to not use force at all. The most effective way is the posturing of force, is the readiness of using force, is the deterrence, is for your opponent to believe that you are perfectly capable of inflicting harm on them, that they actually don't even attempt to cross the line. That's the most effective way, is that you don't have to use it, right? And that is why we say that Surah Al-Anfal is Surah Al-Quwwah. In ayah number 60, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. Prepare for them whichever power you can muster, right? And I will talk a little bit about ayah number 60. It will come up later in today's session, inshallah, right? So as you proceed in life, most of the time, 99% of the time, inshallah, we don't have to be engaged in any type of physical fights. We wouldn't want that, right? Unless you're a soldier, in the military or something like this, right? But most of the time, we don't have to deal with that. But in order to avoid other people inflicting some type of harm on you, again, you have to project power. And I will detail, for you later in the session what that actually means and what are the forms of power that we as Muslims need. I think it was not last Friday, but the Friday before, I gave the khutbah in El Grove, and I think we had the guest speaker here, Brother Nabil. We were talking about kind of the same thing, but I ended up detailing the different facets of power in the khutbah, and I think that the team ended up posting that one. So I will share with you some of the things that, little abridged version of the khutbah, inshallah ta'ala, quickly today. Last time we talked about the necessity of obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, when it comes to being ready to push back against the forces of evil. We also talked about the importance of heeding Allah's call when He invites us to that which makes us alive, right? يا أيها الذين آمنوا استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. Respond to Allah and His Messenger when they invite you to the things that will give you life, right? And we kind of last time talked about what are those things that give us life. And we had a bit of an interesting, discussion about that. We also said that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us to that which gives us life, when we do follow that, Allah will come between you, will intervene between you and your spiritual heart. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَحُولُ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَقَلْبِهِ. Know that Allah intervenes between one and his or her heart. And I explained to you what that meant. Your heart is your consciousness. It is the part of you that will be held accountable. It is the part of you that receives the obligations from God. And also it is the part of you that may experience the punishment in the grave or the punishment in the afterlife. Your spiritual heart basically lives in this vessel that we call the physical body, right? But you are not your physical body. You are not your stomach and your liver and your pancreas and your intestines, right? Pigs and cows and squirrels have similar organs, right? You are not the flesh. The flesh is only a part of who you are. You are made essentially of the qalb, right? The spiritual heart. The spiritual heart is the leader, is in the driver's seat. Okay, that's who you are. When you tune out all the voices and you are aware of your own being, that awareness, when you say, I will do this, the I that speaks in your own mind is your spiritual heart, right? Now you are also made of other things, all the vestiges of the spiritual heart. I said that you are made of nafs, which is your soul, and that is the placeholder of your emotions and your drive and your intensity. You're also made of aql, which is the intellect or the mind, and that is basically the rational component of who you are. It's the calculating part of you. You're also made of the jasad, which is the physical body, and that is what takes you places and you're able to do things, and that is the place of lusts. It's the place of pleasures. It's a place of desires, right? And all of this is governed by the GPS signal that connects you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that the qalb is receiving always fresh information and fresh direction, and that is the ruh, the spirit. And so your spirit will always guide you to do the right thing, because this is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When He says to the angels at the time of creating Adam alayhi salam, He says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِي, I will breathe into Adam from my own spirit, meaning that every single one of us carries that, divine spirit, metaphysically, one way or the other. Your body, your physical body wants something. Your soul wants something. Your aql, your mind wants something. And so they have a tendency to pull you away from the mandate, from the mission that was given to your heart. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, if you obey Allah and His Messenger and you always stay the course, I will come between your heart and the rest of you in order to protect your heart from corruption, so that your heart continues to be in control and it is not being controlled. If your nafs is controlling you, then you are up and down with your emotions, changing your mind constantly. If your aql, if your mind is always in control, you're calculating, you're cold, right? If your body is always in control, then you're always lusting after desires and pleasures. We don't want any of that. We want some of each. I want a little bit of emotion, a little bit of intellect, and a little bit of pleasures and comforts as well. But I still want my qalb to be in full control. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I will give you that strength, because I will stand between all these influences and your heart in order to protect it. We also talked about the concept of fitna last time. And fitna, means so many things. Means trials, tribulations, sedition, influences, right? And we said that fitna has a fire to it, and that fire can engulf everyone and everything if you don't prevent it. And that fire can engulf even the innocent if you don't stand up and do the right thing. وَاتَّقُوا فِتْنَةً لَا تُصِيبَنَّ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا مِنْكُمْ خَاصَّةً. Beware of a fitna that is not inflicted only upon those who have committed injustice. Meaning, even innocent people who've done nothing may become victims of that fitna. And I said last time that the case in point was Gaza, where if Muslim countries were strong enough, the innocent that lost their lives in Gaza would have been spared today. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. We also talked about the tactics that Quraysh, but also all forces of evil usually use across the centuries in order to put out the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, using propaganda, right? We talked about An-Nadr ibn al-Harith last time, going to Persia and borrowing all the tales and the stories, from the Persians, and trying to distract people, from. I think of An-Nadr ibn al-Harith, by the way, as like the Fox News of his time, right? False information, disseminating propaganda. Quite honestly, if I'm being perfectly honest, Fox News is no better than CNN or any or MSNBC. They're all spewing their propaganda one way or the other, depending on the ideology that stands behind them. But we have to be careful with these things. And so they use propaganda, but they also use money. They use a lot of wealth. They spend a lot of wealth. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught us, as we spoke last time, فَسَيُنْفِقُونَهَا, they will spend that wealth, billions and billions of dollars. ثُمَّ تَكُونُ عَلَيْهِمْ حَسْرَةً, and it will become a source of regret for them because it'll amount to nothing in the end. ثُمَّ يُغْلَبُونَ, and they will still be defeated despite all the expenses. And honestly, like I look at the last 75 years in the Western world, pretty much from the establishment of the Zionist state in 1947 until today, it's about 75 years. Look at all the money that was spent in order to support Zionism, in order to fully control the narrative. Look at all the movies that were produced. Look at all the stand-up comedy that was produced. Look at all the influence on the politicians and the money that was given to the PACs and the political campaigns that were financed. Yet, subhanAllah, with the resilience, again going back to the concept of quwwah, the resilience of just a group of people that are standing up bare-chested against missiles, the entire world is changing their views. One country after the other is now jumping ship, right? One country after the other is now severing ties, or imposing sanctions, or refusing or pulling back their diplomats, or refusing to engage in economic ties, and so on and so forth. Haqq ultimately prevails even if it takes time. Now, after all of this groundwork was done in the surah, and all the important ethical lessons were shared, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finally answers the question that the surah started with. Who gets to have the spoils then? Because after the Battle of Badr was over, like I said, the believers are they're following all the habits of pre-Islamic times, and those habits dictate that the soldiers get everything. So there's a dispute between the soldiers about who gets the spoils, and the first ayah, إِنَّمَا الْأَنْفَالُ لِلَّهِ وَلِلرَّسُولِ, the spoils belong to God and His Messenger, right? Don't even ask this question. It's not even relevant. If you come here in order to make money and to take wealth and to take gold and to confiscate weapons, when I was during the Gulf War invasion, I was in Columbus, Ohio at that time. I was still in college, and there's this Bengali brother who American born and raised. He was in the Marines, right? And he served in the Marines for a couple of years. This guy came back absolutely broken. He was a Muslim guy, but piercings and tattoos and everything. So he looked to me like someone who's just removed from his tradition and his culture and his faith and his depth. And he came to our masjid once. We were in Dublin, Ohio, and it's just really big, one of the largest masajid, in the state, in the state of Ohio. And so he came to the masjid, really broken, speaks with hesitation. Half of his words are not making sense. And he asked me to, if someone please come to the parking lot. I have items from my in my trunk that I need to donate to the mosque. So I asked him to pause. Hey, just slow down. He was like all frantic and he wants to get out of there. So I asked him, what is your name? He gave me a Muslim name. What is your background? My parents are from Bangladesh, but I was born and raised here. I was in the Marines and so forth. So I was like, what is your story? He said, my battalion was one of the very first battalions that entered one of the palaces of Saddam Hussein, right? And so literally after the guards left, it was my team, we entered first. And he said there was some servants still left in the palace, and they ended up getting shot. The soldiers, they saw people move, they just shot him. So there was no sign of life. They killed about 12 or 13 people in the palace when they entered. And then we started looting the place. He said we started looting the place. And one of the things, so they took the gold, they took the weapons. You know, Saddam Hussein was very extravagant. You know, so he had in every palace hundreds of AK-47s that are made of pure 24-karat gold, right? And so you can fire those weapons, but they're not made for firing. You know, they're made to be like a trophy. So all the soldiers were collecting, you know, the gold, they were collecting the jewelry, they were collecting all the fancy stuff, subhanAllah, you know, that the dictators left behind and ran away. And he says, one of the things that I collected was a 16th century manuscript of the Quran that was on display in the big hallway as we entered. It was like right in the center in this big glass box. Of course, the soldiers broke it. They broke the box, they looked at it, it was just like some manuscript, who cares? They're going for the gold. But there was something, he says, there's something that awakened in me in that moment when I saw the Quran. I was like, what the heck am I doing? So he took the Quran and he wrapped it up, you know, in sheets. And he took it with him. He put it in his backpack and he took it with him. And all the soldiers were really fighting over the gold, and everyone, you know, was just, they're really like coming out of the palace with plastic bags upon plastic bags, like, you know, the big garbage bags of all the stuff that they collected. And they took everything back and they took it home, right? They took all this stuff home. The amount of historical artifacts, the amount of monuments, the amount of items that could fill hundreds of museums that came out of Iraq. I mean, think of the history. You know, the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians, and then the Muslims came, and no, even before the Muslims, the Persians, and then the Muslims, and then, you know, you have the Greeks and the Romans, you know, all these influences in Iraq. Thousands and thousands and thousands of items that could fill hundreds of museums were all looted from Iraq, right? So many soldiers, when you think about it, even today in the American context, if you ask the average soldier that volunteers for the US military, and you ask him, why are you volunteering? The average soldier is going to tell you why. Because of what? Because the military is going to pay me money, and they're going to pay for my education, and they're going to give me a scholarship for school. Some go, you know, they fought in the Gulf War, for example, you know, after 9/11, driven out of anger or patriotism, whatever. Some do, you know, okay. Regardless of how you and I feel about the idea of blind patriotism, that's subject of another conversation. But the vast majority of people fight for the opportunities. They fight for the possibilities. You are the guy with the gun. You go into a civilian population, people can't defend themselves, so you can take anything you want. Now, I have to say that the U.S. military, after the Gulf War, has started or has been trying to put in place, you know, a lot of regulations, especially when it comes to the sexual exploitation of women and stuff like that, because that used to be rampant. That used to be rampant. And by the way, it's not talked about. It's not, we talk about Hitler and we talk about what the Germans do and we talk about the Holocaust, but we don't talk about what the American and the British soldiers did in Europe, including England, by the way. The tens of thousands of rape cases that are documented and reported. In England, the ally, by the way. In France, the ally of the United States. But you know, what happened in Germany was beyond your imagination when it comes to the sexual exploitation that took place to German, French, and British women. And you can go do that research on your own, by the way. The truth is there. It's just, again, it's embarrassing. People don't want to talk about it. That has continued to improve, I should say, if we're being honest, over the decades. There was a lot of violations, not that many, during the Gulf War in Iraq. You know, a lot of soldiers were accused of rape and stuff like that, but many of them were brought to justice. I don't think that there was an orchestrated campaign on behalf of the marshals to, you know, use this as a weapon. I don't think so. But I think things have improved, definitely. But when you think about it, you're a soldier, you go there, you're not very bright, you're not super educated, you have a weapon, you have unfettered access to whatever you want. The notion that I fight for material opportunity is clear and present in their minds, right? They will pay for my school, they will pay my education, I will have health insurance for life, right? You know, I will always be a veteran, I will pay, $5.99 at the theaters instead of, $11.99. You will always have, some material gain that you will get out of, being in the military, even if you've never fought, even if you only served for 3 years. Perhaps if you're smart enough, you might have some political career. Maybe you'll write a book, like a memoir, and then make money, or maybe run for office. You become a congressman one day. All material things. All material things. And it will be a cherry on top if you can ravage populations and lay waste to cities and take your aggression and anger out on innocent people, right? If you're a sick person, war is the boon, is a boon for you, because you can literally go there and do whatever you want. There's no law that governs you, right? We don't fight for any of these things. If we absolutely have to fight, we don't fight for these things. Like I said, we only fight for principle. That's it. We fight for principle, for values. So after the surah taught us all of that, now the surah circles back. Now, who gets the spoils? That's what you're fighting over, right? Forget this idea. Put it aside. Let me teach you. For 40 ayat, 40 verses of the surah, I am teaching you why we fight. And then, ayah number 41, now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to answer the question. How does He answer the question? Shockingly, 4/5 of the spoils still go to? No. 4/5 of the spoils go to the soldiers. Allah could have spared us this entire conversation, just told us from the beginning, 4/5 will go to the soldiers. After reading all of this, you would have thought that soldiers don't get anything, or soldiers get a very, very small percentage, right? But the point is not to rip the soldiers out of what is rightly theirs, because they're the ones that fought. The point is that they do that for the right reasons, with the right intentions. It's not the drive, it's not the motive, it's not why you're doing it. We're going to give it to you as a cherry on top. That should never be a consideration for you. Subhanallah. Full circle, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still says, yes, you will get 4/5 of them. But that should not be why you're here in the first place. Right? So the ayah here says, وَعَلَمُوا أَنَّمَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَإِنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِلرَّسُولِ 1/5 will go to God and His Messenger. And I will tell you what that means in a second. And then, وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى, to people who are related to the Prophet ﷺ, وَالْيَتَامَى, the orphans, وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, the poor, وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ, the wayfarers. Right? 5 categories. Allah and His Messenger, and then ذِي الْقُرْبَى, the relatives, al-yatama, the orphans, al-masakin, the poor, and ibn as-sabil, the wayfarers. Right? 5 categories. So 4/5 of that will go to the soldiers, and then 1/5 will be distributed amongst these 5 categories. So it'll become 1/5 of the 1/5. Does that make sense? All right. So again, 4/5 will go to the soldiers, and then 1/5 will be distributed on these 5 categories. In other words, of course, Qurtubi, for example, has 26 different opinions about what this actually means in practice. And the scholars have asked all kinds of questions, and they've had all kinds of polemics. What does it mean? Like, what does it mean Allah has a share and the Prophet Muhammad has a share? What does it mean لِذِي الْقُرْبَى? Whose relatives? Is it Banu Hashim? Are we talking about Ahlul Bayt? The Prophet's family? Who gets to get all these shares? Who qualifies as maskeen? Who qualifies as poor? What happens after the Prophet ﷺ passed away? How will his share be distributed, and so on and so forth? One of the best that I've read about this was from Sayyid Qutb, right? And Sayyid Qutb basically says that we are allowing ourselves to talk about something that is not relevant. We don't have spoils of war anymore, because we don't have wars that we're able to fight and win. And we don't have wars that we're not able to fight and win because we don't have jihad. And we don't have jihad because we don't have quwwah. So don't waste your time on these trivialities and focus on building power. focus on building quwwah. And then when you have quwwah, now go back to the ayah. When you start winning battles, then go back to the ayah and see how the spoils are distributed, right? But one of the best opinions, again, as Sayyid Qutb says, is that Allahu wa Rasuluh, Allah and His Messenger, represents the Muslim state that governs in the interest of the ummah, that follows the rules of the Sharia. So it's metaphor for the spiritual representation, that is embedded in the state itself, right? So the government takes 1/5, and that 1/5 of the spoils is distributed in accordance with the needs, right? Projects of infrastructure, schools, clinics, helping the poor, whatever it is, right? Maybe use some of that to help local populations, which Muslims, did historically a lot, right?
Who was responsible for the initial distribution?
What do you mean?
As in, when they captured it, it wasn't within the soldiers that they had the permission to distribute it within themselves. It must have been collected first and then distributed.
No. Prior to the Battle of Badr, they just, whoever can take something, they took it. What's the word? Finders keepers. Finders keepers. I took this. After Badr, now everyone has to bring the spoils to the leadership, and then the leadership will take full account of the spoils, full inventory, and then they distribute it back equally. So even because some soldiers just so happen to be like standing guarding a post very far away. Some soldiers happen to be like doing nursing work. Some soldiers were doing something else. So now it becomes a competition. I want to be the one in combat because the one in combat gets to get the spoils. And soldiers are running away from the other positions that will not grant them the same opportunity. But when you take the spoils and then now centrally take inventory and distribute it evenly between all the soldiers, then it becomes a more fair process. And so only after Badr that actually started to be the case, right? So the remaining 1/5, there's 1/5 that stays under the control of the state, hence Allahu wa Rasul, Allah and His Messenger, represented in that state that administers the process and does it in accordance with the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the teachings of Islam, right? None of this matters, and I will share with you something that Sayyid Qutb actually says here, and I took a screenshot. Where is it? So here's what he says. لقد استدار الزمان كهيئته يوم جاء هذا الدين إلى البشرية أول مرة. He says that time took a 360-degree turn, and now it looks like the very first day when Islam dawned on humanity for the first time. Right? After 1400 years, we took this full turn. We're going back to the way that the world used to be when Islam came. Right? وَرَجَعَ النَّاسُ إِلَى الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا. And people returned to the same form of jahiliyyah that people lived and experienced in pre-Islamic times. Right? I think we can attest to that. Right? فَأَشْرَكُوا مَعَ اللَّهِ أَرْبَابًا أُخْرَى. And they took other deities alongside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala تُصَرِّفُ حَيَاتِهِمْ بِشَرَائِعِهَا الْبَشَرِيَّةِ. Managing their lives with their man-made laws, which is exactly how things used to be before Islam. Islam came in order to teach us that we should be governed by divine laws, not man-made laws. Or that man-made laws should only be a reflection of divine laws. So we made this full circle. We went back to like we used to be before Islam. And we've adopted a new form of jahiliyyah. Al-jahiliyyah al-mu'asira. Contemporary jahiliyyah, as Sayyid Qutb calls it. وَلَقَدْ عَادَ هَذَا الدِّينُ أَدْرَاجَهُ لِيَدْعُ النَّاسَ مِنْ جَدِيدٍ إِلَى الدُّخُولِ فِيهِ. This deen of ours went back to the basics, calling people to now commit themselves to it again. A renewed type of commitment, a renewed type of subscription. إِلَى شَهَادَةِ أَن لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَأَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. To testify again that there's no God but Allah and that Muhammad is His messenger. صلى الله عليه وسلم. إلى إفراد الله بالألوهية والحاكمية والسلطان. to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala His due right, to be the only source of authority in your life, to be the only source of influence in your life, to be the only true king in your life, and not the kings and the sultans of man. So again, this I don't think that we can dispute what Sayyid Qutb says here, that we've gone back almost to pre-Islamic times, and now Islam needs to preach itself again in a fresh way to humanity and detail its rules and detail its teachings. So why are we concerned so much about the fiqhi details of the distribution of the spoils? What spoils? You don't have any spoils. You are the spoil. You've lost the war and you've been defeated and you've become the spoil for the enemy. So what's the point of wasting so much time on abstractness? All right. So it's an interesting point that he makes. Don't waste too much time on these nitty-gritty details, but rather focus on what quwwah is and how to build that power in your own home, in your own family, in your own community, and kind of grow from there. Allah reminds us then of the details of the battle. Look at ayah number 42. And we talked about this briefly before. إِذْ أَنْتُمْ بِالْعُدْوَةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ بِالْعُدْوَةِ الْقُصْوَى وَالرَّكْبُ أَسْفَلَ مِنْكُمْ وَلَوْ تَوَاعَدْتُمْ لَاخْتَلَفْتُمْ فِي الْمِعَادِ وَلَكِنْ لِيَقْضِيَ اللَّهُ أَمْرًا كَانَ مَفْعُولًا. Remember on that day, when you were at the near end of the valley of Badr, and they were at the farthest end of the valley, and the caravan was below you. It was on the other side of the mountain. So the mountain range is right here by the Red Sea, and the caravan is already hiding behind the mountain. The army of the Muslims is at the farthest end of the valley. The army of Quraysh is at the upper end of the valley. They can't see each other. Quraysh cannot see their caravan. The Muslims can't see Quraysh. Nobody can see each other. It's just desert. They could have actually gone home and called it a day. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted for that to happen, right? Why? Because the Muslims left their homes on that day wanting the smaller reward, which is, the wealth that comes from the caravan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to give them the bigger reward, which is victory in battle, to establish themselves, on the ground, to pivot, right? To start learning, having that taste for victory, right? And then one of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does in order to help us in situation of confrontation, when we are about to take on an opponent that seems formidable, and we feel so weak and small, right? Like, let's say, you're 5'4", and you're a high school kid, and then you're being bullied by someone who's like 6'2", big guy from, a gym rat that is just going around, hurting kids at school. Very difficult for someone to stand up against someone like this, right? But perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make that person look smaller in your eyes. This person is just a paper tiger. These gym muscles are not going to deceive anyone, okay? These balloons that you have, they're not going to deceive anyone. And sometimes you standing your ground, even though you're a little guy, but you standing your ground, giving off that charisma, that strength, might actually deter this person. Yes, you might sustain a couple of bruises, but you will emerge on that day a true man, a strong person that is respected by everybody else. Sometimes we avoid confrontation because we see that the opponent is much bigger than us. And because the confrontation is so necessary. Remember what the surah is teaching us. This person is going around bullying other kids at school, uttering profanities, having the most horrible influence on everyone else, making life at school completely unbearable. Someone's going to stand up to this guy, right? Someone's going to stand up to this guy, right? What does it take? Okay, I'm going to get a couple of punches in the face. I'm going to get bruised up, right? Okay. But then in the long term, I've stopped evil from happening. And if I don't do that, remember, fitnatun fil ardi wa fasadun kabir. There's going to be so much corruption on earth if I don't do that. So much fitna if I don't do that. And if you can't do it by yourself, get a couple other guys and do it together. 3, 4. Teach him a lesson, just one lesson. We don't like aggression. We don't like the use of force. We would rather not. And if 3 or 4, 5 guys stand up against this one 6'3", maybe there will be no fighting. Maybe say, okay, I don't want to get in trouble with 5 guys. So bring 5 people together, pivot, stand your ground, surround them. If you don't stop, we're going to hurt you. Maybe like, just do that, no disrespect. I don't want any trouble. And then he just walks away. And then confrontation was averted. But the purpose was achieved. The objective was achieved. All right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here in 43 to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِذْ يُرِيكَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَنَامِكَ قَلِيلًا. You remember the eve of battle, I told you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent some rain that cleansed kept the sand together, made the soil a little bit stronger, made the earth firmer under their feet. But also they slept. They fell asleep. They fell asleep so soundly that many of them had dreams. The Prophet ﷺ had dreams. Now we don't have an actual hadith that tells us what he saw in that dream. I actually looked for it. We don't have it, not from the Sahih. But the ayah says, إِذْ يُرِيكَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَنَامِكَ. Allah made you, saw your opponent in your dream to be very few. Even though there were 1,000 and you were only 300, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made you see them, very few. وَلَوْ أَرَاكَهُمْ كَثِيرًا لَفَشِلْتُمْ وَلَتَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Had you seen them for who they really are, larger than you and stronger than you, there would have been hesitation. There would have been disagreements. Oh, are we going to win? We're not going to win. Maybe we need to, call for peace. Maybe we need to go home, right? And so because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted the battle to happen and He wanted you to stand your ground and He wanted you to push back against the bully, He made them appear smaller in your eyes. And that, does happen, sometimes. Remember in China, I think it was like 20 years ago, when Chinese activists gathered up in the Tiananmen Square and they pushed back against government tanks. Remember the iconic picture of this guy that's standing against the tank holding the rock? You see some of these kids in Palestine, right? Holding rocks and standing there, and all the armored vehicles and the tanks are coming at them. These kids are standing there with their rocks. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the enemy smaller in your eyes. And that is why the one thing that scares those sissies so much is little Palestinian kids with rocks on their hands. Can you imagine the cowardice that you're so scared of a teenager with a rock? That's all the weapon that they have. And you have all the US financed machinery, yet you're scared of this little one. Subhanallah. So, again, that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us here. But another great tactic, when you feel that you are standing alone in the face of that formidable opponent, is to reach into that deep corner of your intimate existence and derive power from your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Seek that power from deep inside and make dhikr. You mention Allah's name. And we're not saying here, oh, you shouldn't be ready or you should just go to battle bare-chested. No. After taking all of your precautions and all of your training and all of your everything that's at your disposal, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ, right? The whole point of the surah is that you prepare whatever power you have. But after doing all of this, and you still see that your opponent is a little bigger than you, so you're at school and then you're 6'5" guys right there, and you're standing your ground, you're about to take him on. And then you feel that little fear in your heart. You say what? La ilaha illallah. You say Allahu Akbar. You make some dhikr that you personally are able to relate to. So look at 45. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا لَقِيتُمْ فِئَةً فَاثْبُتُوا وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. O you who believe, O you who have attained to faith, when you meet a host, when you meet an enemy or you meet an opponent in battle, be firm, pivot your feet, right? And remember God. Mention the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This idea of pivoting, by the way, is really interesting because it's not easy. You know, you're what, like 5'6", maybe, right? Little. You're 5'3.5". Okay, that's close enough. That's close enough. You know, this is 6'2" guy. You know, is going to be pretty huge for you, right? So you take this guy on. You know, hey, you know, you've been going to your jujitsu classes. You know, you're all martial artsy, but this guy is still triple your size, right? So I'm not asking your son to commit any acts of violence, by the way. You know, we're just talking about this hypothetical situation where you just turn out to be the only guy that can stop that evil from happening, right? This person is just ravaging the school, right? Yeah, you got to do something about it, right? So you're taking this guy on. A couple of your friends are standing right there. At some moment or the other, there's that little fear that just comes in the heart. You know, am I going to be, man, if this guy like goes like this, I'm going to fly, right? Sure, there's a clear possibility that that could happen. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says at that moment, you want to do two things. Pivot, right? Make sure that you stick your feet into the ground, all right? I'm not going to go anywhere. Sometimes that little ounce of courage, wallahi, stands up against a tank. That little ounce of courage can scare a guy that is 3 times your size. Because yes, he's big, but he may not have your heart. That's the trick. He may not have your heart. He has muscles 5 times your size, but he does not have the heart. What wins battles? It's this. This is what wins battles. Sooner or later, the Zionists are going to lose. Why? Because they're cowards. Not because they don't have tanks and jets, but because they're cowards. And Palestinians will have to win eventually. Why? Because they have a heart. Because they have courage. That's it. What do they have to lose? You know, you take my life, I'm a shaheed, I go to Jannah. And if I win, I defeat you, then alhamdulillah, I have both khair in this dunya and khair in the akhirah. You can't possibly defeat me. You cannot defeat someone who has a warrior that has that kind of spirit, right? So, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, once you, O you who believe, once you see your opponent, pivot the ground, right? Don't act in a foolhardy way, you know, don't be foolish, right? You have to be prepared, you have to have a plan, right? You have to have some kind of strategy, but you got to posture. And sometimes posturing is what wins you. Because like, why is this guy so confident? Oh my God. What if he's like the nephew of the principal or something? You know, what if his dad is like a congressman? You know, what if his dad is the sheriff? I don't know. He looks like super confident. Oh my God, do you guys know this kid? Now there is a lot of doubt in his mind and a lot of confidence in yours. Okay? So only when you posture, that can sometimes resolve 75% of the conflicts. Because they don't know what you represent. They don't know what's behind you. So you're a mystery to them. So they would rather not stir the pot or poke the bear, you know, or mess with the wasp's nest, as they say. And then you might actually get it resolved by just posturing, by pivoting and standing your ground. Right? That's quwwah right there. That's power. When you're able to get a conflict resolved without taking a single swing, that's power. And that's what Surat Al-Anfal is teaching us. All these other tactics to get it all resolved by emanating that strength. All right? 46. وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَلَا تَنَازَعُوا فَتَفْشَلُوا. Obey on Allah and His Messenger, and do not allow yourself to be in constant dispute with one another, in disagreement and division with one another. We're about to fight the battle. You can't argue with your 2 friends when you're standing up, you know, in front of Big Johnny. You can't. You can have a dispute back in the classroom, but once you're in the battlefield, you got to be focused on this guy. You can't be disagreeing on strategy. You know, there's always time for conversations. But once in the battlefield, there is only time for what? For action and obedience. There is a leader, and the leader says we're going to do X. It doesn't have to make sense to you. Officers say we're going in that direction, soldiers have to follow. Otherwise, battles will be lost. Now, when the battle is over, or maybe before the battle, we can always share our opinions, we can always have our conversations, that's fine. But once in battle, by the way, even, wallahi, I do this personally. So let's say, because I consider that every tarbiyah event to be like a battlefield. Especially like, Ramadan, for example, this is like, our Badr. Not to suggest that the community is Quraysh, but, it feels sometimes like you're fighting a war when you have like a couple of thousand people coming. Eid is a big battle. And so I always think that some of these big events, it's like fighting a big battle. And then there is someone that is assigned to be the leader. All right? And it's usually not me. It's usually someone from the staff, or maybe someone from the volunteers, or someone from the board. Brother so-and-so is in charge of Salatul Eid. Okay? That's the battlefield. And this is a lesson for us to learn, by the way. Things happen, and issues and disputes, and he's a community member is complaining about this, and oh my God, this happened, and the coffee pot spilled, and one of the kids is missing. So people come to me, and they say, oh my God, Imam, what do we do? I was like, I don't know. Go ask him over there. He's in charge. Because if I say X and then they said Y, then what happens? Then that's it. We're going to be run over. We're going to be eaten alive. If the ranks are shaky and people start seeing like signs of weakness and disputes, naturally that's going to get exploited. It's going to be taken advantage of, and then we're not able to make a decision. So I always say, guys, in the field, you always refer to your leader and ask, tell me, X or Y, that's it. You don't have to explain it to me. You don't have to tell me why. I don't need your reasoning or your logic. Just tell me which direction to go. Point me in the right direction, I'll go. That's all I need to know. In the battlefield. Now, when we evaluate, after the fight is over, when we sit and evaluate, we can always discuss so that we can do it better, next time. So it's just good ethic to learn, as we engage in community service, as we work, to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our community. I know that it's a bit of a stretch to compare, Salatul Eid with the Battle of Badr, but, in general, I think it's a good ethic in life. There is time for conversations, and then there's time for action. So we obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially in battles. We obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we refrain from disputations. We refrain from divisions. And we can always discuss that later. And then it says, وَاصْبِرُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. Exercise patience and perseverance, for Allah is with those who are patient in adversity. Because it's not going to be easy. Sometimes you have to listen to something that you don't necessarily like. I'm pretty sure we need to do that other thing, right? Sometimes it's very easy for us to get heated. It's very easy for us to feel like I should take credit. It's very easy for us to feel like I should be the one to make decisions. But this is exactly what the opponent is waiting for. He's waiting for the slightest sign of weakness in order to, you've already lost the battle. There's no quwwah in this. There's no power. You already lost, right? So whatever it is that you need to do it before. But then when you're ready to fight, then do nothing but fighting, right? The other thing that needs to be avoided is boastful behavior, is pretentiousness, is arrogance, is making this into something that's about you and not about the cause. And in 47, Allah teaches us that وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ خَرَجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ بَطَرًا وَرِئَاءَ النَّاسِ. And be not like those, the unbelievers, who left their homes and went from their homelands full of self-conceit. They're so conceited, right? And a desire to be seen and praised by men. That's why they left their homes. Do we fight, for glory? We don't. We can't. But Quraysh did. Abu Sufyan was busy trying to take the caravan to safety. That was his focus. Save the money. But Abu Jahl, who led the army of Quraysh, he wasn't focused on this. He was focused on making a statement. So he brought the slaves, and he brought clowns, and he brought animals, and he brought monkeys, and he brought entertainers. And he was throwing feasts and parties and getting the belly dancers out. And he was slaughtering animals and offering food and campfires. He was having his fun, right? This is a party for him. And then when Abu Sufyan heard about this, Abu Sufyan got upset. What is this guy doing? Why is he doing this? Now we're fighting for the wrong reasons. Abu Sufyan, who was not even Muslim at the time, he's from Quraysh. He's like, guys, you left Mecca in order to protect my caravan. My caravan was protected, okay? What are you doing? And then he says, I swear Abu Jahl is doing this for himself. He's doing this for his own status. He's not doing this for Quraysh. And Allah does not like this. That's what Abu Sufyan said. In our fight with Muhammad, Allah is not going to side with us if this is how we're acting. And subhanAllah, his words were definitely very prescient. And only a few hours later, he was proven to be right. And Abu Jahl, was one of the people that were killed in that battle. Right? So regardless of how people of batil carry themselves, we don't do that. One of the things that hurt me the most, even though it shouldn't really hurt me, is when you find pieces of garbage like, Marco Rubio or those guys, they go to the US military installations, right? And they sign missiles with Sharpies. They sign missiles. We call missiles really funny names in this country, right? They call them Azrael, This word, by the way, it does not exist in the Islamic tradition. But in, Christians and Jews, this is for them, this is the angel of death, right? Azrael, or Azrael. Azrael. They actually call some jet fighters Azrael. And they call some missiles Azrael, right? Hellfire missile. And then they call them. They actually, some Zionist soldiers, they write on their missiles, baby killer. Explicitly, right? Explicitly. Because for them, war is important in and of itself. It's not difficult means to an end as it is for us. For us, we don't celebrate war. We don't celebrate death. Something like this happens and we do it and we feel bad about it, but we do it because we absolutely must. If you're fighting a just war, right? I did not see, the Pakistani army, going around bragging about killing Indian civilians. In fact, what they did is that they resorted back to the Quran and they gave the operation a Quranic name, right? And the Quranic name also implies defense. Bunyanun marsus means that we are, strong ranks standing together in order to defend ourselves against aggression. There's nothing boastful about this statement. The situation in India is also very complicated because there's hundreds of millions of Muslims in India, right? And so sometimes we callously say, oh, India, 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 but which I think we need to be careful. We're not talking about India. We're talking about the current Hindutva, racist, bigoted, Islamophobic government of Modi. So we have to be very specific what we're talking about here. And so we don't boast about these things. We don't throw a party because we've taken life, right? Muslims actually buried their enemy and their friend together in the battlefield, right? They allowed the priests and the rabbis and the people from the other side to come and pray over their dead, right? There was this tremendous prohibition against the mutilation of the dead or the desecration of their graves, exhuming the bodies, full blanket prohibitions against all of these things. Because for us, we don't celebrate that moment. It's the most unfortunate thing imaginable that disputes need to be resolved by force. And if you absolutely must, you don't celebrate that moment. You pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it ends as soon as possible. But there are people that just thrive in the culture of hate. They thrive in the culture of war because they profit from it. The military-industrial complex. Remember Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and the companies that were created in order to service the U.S. Army, companies that make food, companies that make backpacks, companies that make pants and jackets, companies that make caps, companies that make this particular device and that particular instrument. And I'm not even talking about weapons. I'm talking about everything else. billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in contracts that were given to those companies. They stand so much to lose. And you see what happens to the world when the purpose of war becomes profit. It becomes perpetual. It doesn't end. You see what happens in the world when a sick-minded psychopath, such as the prime minister of the Zionist entity, who all he's doing really is fighting for survival, right? That's because if the war ends tomorrow, he's going to get arrested and he has to answer to the illegal things that he has done, right? But he's keeping everyone distracted by keeping that war raging. In fact, U.S. emissary after the other made the same statement. It's not Hamas that is stalling the negotiations. It's the Zionist government, because they don't want the war to end. See? Because it's not fairness and justice and value and principle that is driving them. It's other considerations. And once other considerations are in the picture, so much evil happens in the world. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in ayah number 50 makes a statement here that, sooner or later, justice will be served. Either justice will be served at the hands of the believers, or later on in life, evil will still meet their maker. Okay? If you look at the ayah, وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ يَتَوَفَّى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا الْمَلَائِكَةُ يَضْرِبُونَ وُجُوهَهُمْ وَأَدْبَارَهُمْ وَذُوقُوا عَذَابَ الْحَرِيقِ. The angels participated in that war. Okay? And so some of the enemy died in battle, they were killed in battle, some by the believers, some by the angels. But what the ayah says is that even if they did not die in battle, even if you could not defeat the Big Johnny, what happens? One day, inshallah, you're going to become a Stanford scientist. You're going to own a $150 million company. You're going to become a neurosurgeon. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant you success in this dunya, one way or the other, before He gives you the success of the akhirah. Okay? But what happens to Big Johnny? What happens to these 6'2", hunks? What happens to them? They will be flipping patties at McDonald's. Or they might end up in jail. Or he's going to be your truck driver. You're going to see him at the docks, right? When you're 45 years old, you're going to see this guy. He works for a guy that works for a guy that works for a guy that works for you. Because justice eventually gets served, one way or the other. And if not in this dunya, it gets served in the akhirah. Okay? So the same angels, Allah says, the same angels that may have directly participated in the battle of Badr and killed the enemy on behalf of the believers, will also be the same angels that will take, if they were spared in the battle, the angels will take their souls later on in their life as they age. Sooner or later they will die. It's either they die in battle, or they die by old age, or they die by cancer, or they die by disease, or they die by drugs, or God knows, an accident, whatever it is. Later on, sooner or later, the angels will take their souls. It's either they take their souls in the battle, or they take their souls later on in life. But the manner by which they take their souls is very humiliating, because it says, right, يَضْرِبُونَ وُجُوهَهُمْ وَأَدْبَارَهُم, right? The angels will strike their faces and their backs in punishment as they take their souls. Not only that they're dying, they die in the most humiliating way possible. Subhanallah. So again, what are the conditions of victory? After preparing yourself, after mustering all the power that you can. It may be limited, but it's all you've got, right? What are the conditions after? Steadfastness, as I said, pivoting. Number 2, dhikr, to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 3, obedience to Allah Azza wa Jal and His directives. Number 4, the avoidance of division and strife to the best of your ability. Number 5, perseverance, because there's going to be consequences. You have to be patient to whatever that could happen next. And number 6, refraining from boastful behavior, right? We don't do this for glory. We do this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This discussion is followed by a reference to Pharaoh and his entourage, which is interesting that it was inserted here, right? So if you look at ayat 52, 53, and 54. So 52 and 54 talk about Fir'aun, right? Actually, they're almost saying the same thing. كَدَأْبِ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ, the like of what happened to Pharaoh. It's repeated twice. So 52 says it and 54 says it. And then between them there is one ayah that makes a very important statement, subhanAllah. So again, nations and peoples will always be safe unless they engage in what? Unless they engage in injustice. Ibn Taymiyyah used to say, الدولة الكافرة تحيا ولو كانت الدولة الكافرة تحيا إذا كانت عادلة. A nation that is made of the unbelievers will always live on if it is just. والدولة المسلمة تموت لو كانت غير عادلة. And a nation that is made of Muslims may die if it engages in injustice. Right? I am rewording what he said. He says it very poetically, right? But the idea here is very clear. Just because you're Muslim doesn't mean that your political entity or construct will survive. It may not survive because you have engaged in injustice. And someone that is not Muslim, that engages in unjust conduct, they may actually outlast you or survive you. So as long as we refrain from dhulm, the minute we engage in dhulm, you become subject to divine retribution. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from that. So think of Fir'aun, okay? Had he not engaged in calling himself God, had he ruled justly, had he not enslaved people, had he not go after the firstborn of Bani Israel, had he not engaged in all these horrific things? I mean, there were Egyptian pharaohs that did okay, right? They were not horrific people, and their dynasties lasted for long. But this guy engaged in the worst behavior. Who brought him down? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of his injustice. So ayah number 53 is really important here. Again, between this discussion, in the middle of the discussion on Fir'aun. ذلك بأن الله لم يكن مغيرا نعمة أنعمها على قوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. Allah would never change the blessings with which He has graced a people unless they change it from themselves. So when you are in a good state, and mashallah you have wealth and health and family and all kinds of good things, Allah is not going to change that state unless you have allowed corruption to seep into your heart on your own. That was your choice. You want to maintain the ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Protect your heart from corruption so that the blessings are protected. But if the blessings, one after the other, being taken away from you, then you have to examine yourself and see, what have I done? Because I must have gotten complacent. I must have allowed myself to lapse, and that is why the blessings have been taken away from me. So Fir'aun could have avoided destruction had he not engaged in this type of corruption, right? But this also teaches us something really important, because I imagine sometimes if I lived at the time of Fir'aun, right? If you lived at the time of Fir'aun, who would you, like, I'm Egyptian, right? But if I lived at the time of Fir'aun, which camp would I want to belong to? The Egyptians or the Hebrews? Of course, because the Hebrews were the Muslims of their time. They were the men and women of God. Even though I myself, I am of Egyptian descent, I think like 30% of my DNA is Fir'aun, right? That's the part that I'm trying to forget about. I actually have 5% Jewish as well. Just don't forget that. And so there is obviously that history, and if you look at that history, okay, these are presumably my people. No, they're not. Right? They're not my people, because my people are the Muslims, regardless of where they are. It doesn't really matter. Okay? And so if I lived at those times, then I would probably be in the camp of Musa alayhi salam. And if you are in the camp of Musa alayhi salam, I mean, you would be a slave, right? That's it. You would literally be owned by another human being. There's hundreds of thousands, some scholars say about 1 million of those Hebrew slaves that lived in Egypt at the time. All descendants of the 12 tribes, that were the sons of Yaqub alayhi salam, when Yusuf alayhi salam migrated to Egypt and lived there, and all the tribes came and settled in Egypt, all of their descendants basically were enslaved eventually by some of the pharaohs. Okay, so if I lived at the time of Musa alayhi salam, and I am one of the slaves in the Hebrew community, I would have looked at Pharaoh as the absolute most powerful thing imaginable. I would have seen this as an inevitability that can never be broken, a reality that can never change. I am a slave, I live in Egypt, I am beholden to those people, nothing can change, right? I'm pretty sure that that's the same feeling that a Jewish person in concentration camps in the Auschwitz in Poland had felt about Nazi rule, because Nazi Germany was unstoppable. Up until like the early 1944, it was almost unstoppable. It basically outmatched the West in everything. It exceeded, the UK and the United States in military technology, in drive, in will, in organization, in military planning. It looked like an unstoppable force, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to treat this disease in the human mind, He wants to teach you there is no such thing as inevitabilities. In Arabic, al-hatmiyat. Al-hatmiyat. Our minds are infected by all these inevitabilities. Al-hatmiyat, the inevitability of economic power. All these massive corporations, no one can even nudge them out of their path. Political inevitabilities. The control of the Zionism of the United States and Republicans and Democrats, and the US is the most powerful country on earth. It's like an inevitability, like it can't change, right? The Zionist state feels like it's something that it can't change. Global order feels like it can't change. Capitalism feels like it can't change, right? In many of our minds, we think that these are established things. We just have to negotiate with them and find a way to survive under them. And we need to just borrow a little bit from democracy, a little bit from capitalism, a little bit from market economy, and put our own Muslim touch on them and survive. We have to use, capitalism has banks, so we have to use banks, but they're going to be like Islamic banking system. We're just going to adjust them a little bit. Right? They have political parties. We want to have our own Islamic political parties. They have these institutions. Because I can't imagine a reality that does not have all of those things. Because in my mind, hatmiyah, it's inevitable. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to teach you by bringing the story of Fir'aun is that, Muslims, maybe you thought that Quraysh was an inevitability as well. You thought that the Roman Empire was an inevitability. You thought that the Persian Empire was an inevitability, right? You thought that these things would never change. Yet what happened in 30 years? They were all gone. And all replaced by a completely new reality and a new world order. For a long time, that world order was inspired by Islam. All right? So all the inevitabilities that you see in the world today may not last as long as you think that they would. 4 or 5 years. It looks like Trump is hastening the process when you think about it, right? وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Sometimes you hate something when it's good for you. All the disruption that is taking place in the political system today, all it takes is just a watershed moment, right? And it all comes down very, 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 very quickly. And so the only inevitability that we need to accept is that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. Everything else can change. And it can change so quickly. Don't count on things just remaining stagnant forever. Allah Azza wa Jal has His way. And we're almost done here for today. Ultimately, fighting has a very specific purpose, and it has a very specific direction. It's not indefinite. We don't fight endless war campaigns. We always have a reason. And it's a very important reason. And it's a reason that we could not avoid, right? We were defending a particular principle, and we could not find any other method except the use of force. Which also means that if invited to treaties, if invited to agreements, you should do what? You should always accept. If they invite you for some kind of an agreement that would achieve your purposes without you having to fight, that would be the most perfect scenario, right? However, if your opponent starts violating those agreements, then you are not bound by those agreements. Like, I keep looking at the Palestinian people today. We keep using, Gaza and Palestine as an example because it's the one thing that is very alive in our minds, but there could be so many other examples. If the Zionists keep giving the Palestinian people one promise after the other, oh, if you do this, I'll give you some territory. No, it's okay. Like, I'll give, in the Oslo Accords, for example, we'll give you the West Bank, but we're going to divide the West Bank into 75 tiny little pieces, and there's going to be checkpoints between them. And hey, 2 years, and we're going to remove all of that, and it's going to be okay. They keep lying to you about every single promise. When will you eventually wake up and say, my haqq is not going to be extracted from their hands by promises and diplomacy? It's not going to work. When will you wake up? I'm just a nice person. I'm kind. I'm going to keep trying to make the treaties work. Dude, it did not work on day one. It's not going to work. You're wasting your time. People in Palestine today that are realizing that the Oslo Accords and all these lies were designed really to tame them and to castrate them and to take something from them that otherwise they would have let go. I think they are now under attack. And the cowards like Abbas and those guys who are still, I don't think that these people work, for the interests of the Palestinian people. I think that they're all traitors. I think they're all being supported and propped up by the Zionists, right? But that's my own little conspiracy theory. But even if they were not traitors, even if in their own minds they think that they fight for the interests of the Palestinian people, they have violated all of their promises, one after the other. When are you going to wake up and realize that this is not working? So if you actually look at the ayah here, 56, الَّذِينَ عَاهَدْتَ مِنْهُمْ ثُمَّ يَنْقُضُونَ عَهْدَهُمْ فِي كُلِّ مَرَّةٍ وَهُمْ لَا يَتَّقُونَ. Every single time they make a promise, they break their promise. For how long are you going to keep adhering to these promises? You got to move on. Okay, it's not working, guys. You have to resort back to coercive means because it's clearly this is not working. Subhanallah. This is in reference to some of the treaties that the Ansar had with local Jewish tribes. And the Quran is telling them these treaties are not carved in stone. They are conditional. They're conditional upon they're conditional upon the following and the adherence of your opponent. If your opponent does not follow them, then you are under no obligation to follow them. It's very, very clear and simple. One of the things that I don't know if you're familiar with this history. Who was the last British monarch that reigned over the United States before the War of Independence? Anyone knows? You got to know your history. It's not Henry, it's George. It's George III. He's basically the British king that lost, North America to the rebels. Basically, he was the monarch that ruled over this country. George III. And interestingly, the history that you are taught, by the way, is always remember this. Don't ever forget this. The history that you are taught as an American Muslim, as an American in general, is a history that is written by those who actually took this country from the Brits. Don't forget that. This is the version of events that was seen through the eyes of the American rebels. And this is how it's documented. And naturally, the Brits are made out to be what in that history? They're made out to be like savage, and they're made out to be like very bad people, which could be true, but it's not necessarily true. You always have to read history through the eyes of the other guy as well. Otherwise, history is written by the victor. And in that particular war, the United Kingdom was not the victor. Now, you know how I feel about the Brits, all right? So I'm not defending the Brits. They were horrific in every other way. But I'm just saying there has to be some type of fairness about how we read history. So Henry III, George III, right? George III, I think it was maybe about 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. So 1776 is the Declaration of Independence, right? So this is like, I think it was like in the early 1760s. So it's 1760 some, I don't remember the date. He actually signed a treaty with the Native Americans that was called the King's Proclamation for Native American lands. All right? The King's Proclamation, King George actually wanted to avoid any confrontation with the Native Americans, and he wanted to preserve Native American culture, and he was a proponent that Native Americans need to build their own colonies alongside the white colonies, in New England. So the King's Proclamation actually dictated that there's going to be a line, like an invisible line, north-south, across the Appalachian Mountains. Which states do the Appalachian Mountains run through? Colorado and New Mexico? No. Kansas and Minnesota and Texas? No. The Appalachian Mountains are actually in the far east of the United States. The Appalachian Mountains run through South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, New Hampshire, even parts of New York, parts of Ohio, all in the east. In other words, had British rule continued to reign over the United States, and had this country just been like maybe associated with the Great Britain, the way Canada and Australia are associated with Great Britain, there was actually clear British policy to avoid confrontation with Native Americans. Native American states and Native American civilization could have actually thrived here. The absolute carnage, the genocide that took place, the murder of millions and millions and millions of Native Americans could have actually been avoided. Of course, that's conjecture. I'm not saying that this is certain, but I'm just saying, the Brits are often made into this boogeyman, and the rebels are made into the nice people. But then every single thing that the rebels did from the establishment of the United States until the 1960s was the oppression of black people, the oppression of the Jewish people, the oppression of Native Americans, the oppression of immigrants, the oppression of people of Mexican origin. That's all they did. All they did was to enslave people and hurt people and displace people and murder people, if I'm being perfectly honest. This is what the so-called rebels that fought for the American Revolution and the American independence, that's what they did. And they kept pushing this line west because they couldn't help themselves. Who can stop the lust for more land and more territory and westward, expansion? They could not stop it. You think of Abraham Lincoln, right? 1840s. Abraham Lincoln, he's the one that fought the war, the Civil War, and he's the one that united that united the United States, right? But one of the things, the consequences of the Civil War that a lot of people don't talk about is that 5, I think, or 6 of the major Native American tribes were allied with the South. People don't know that. The Cherokee and some of those groups, they were, the Chickasaws and the Cherokees, they were all allied with the South. The Navajo were also in the South. They're in what is today New Mexico. So many of the Native American tribes were allied with the South in the war. They had to choose one side or the other. So what happens when the South lost the war? The United States federal government inflicted its severe punishment not only on the people of the South, but also on Native Americans. And that line was constantly moved further west. There's more displacement and more enslavement and more murder and genocide that happened to Native Americans at the time of Abraham Lincoln and onwards, more than the 100 years or 150 years prior when the whites, the colonists, came to North America for the first time. What's that? There you go. Now the thing is, Native American chiefs constantly, like in their memoirs, there's this really important book, if you're interested in Native American history. It's called Lost My Soul at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee was a known massacre that happened in South Dakota, for Native Americans. That you need to read this history, by the way. There's Native Americans like a couple of clicks away from you. You live in Rockland, there's Native American reservations right there. There's people that live in manifest poverty, like it's a third world country, a couple of traffic lights from your homes. You just live in your suburban, wealthy bubble. Literally parts of Placer County, there's Native American reservations. People live in absolute abject poverty because they get no services from the federal government whatsoever. So the line kept moving, and Native American chiefs kept saying, every single time, we trust the white man. Every single time, we have to trust it. We have to say it's going to be better. They're gonna fulfill their promise this time. They're going to do it this time. Not once were those promises ever fulfilled. Not once. Always a couple of years later, someone comes in and said, no, guys, we're gonna have to move the line, a little bit further, until the line was moved into the Pacific Ocean. There's no line anymore, and it was all taken, right? So that's what the ayah is saying. Don't just subscribe to some notion of peace when it's not real. You subscribe to it if your opponent is doing the same exact thing. And then we end here with ayah number 60. And that is for today's discussion. And I hope that all the events of the battle and all the teachings of the surah have prepared us now to understand why ayah number 60 is so important. This is the pivot. This is the fulcrum. This is the center of gravity of Surah Al-Anfal, and this is what gave Surah Al-Anfal its theme, right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. Prepare or muster whatever power you can muster for the enemy, any form of power. And in the khutbah, I actually talked about 7 or 8 forms of power that would be relevant for us as a Muslim community today, right? I talked about spiritual power. So you have to be grounded in your own faith. You have to be grounded in your own ibadat, right? You cannot just be an activist that is not connected to his or her spiritual roots, right? And then there is mental power. You can't get under your skin. You have to have clarity of your goals and what you're trying to achieve. It's like Lut alayhi salam, when his house was surrounded by people that wanted to literally gang rape his guests, who happened to be angels that are coming to destroy the city, right? He says, oh, لو أن لي بكم قوة. If I only have power over you. And he was so upset. أو آوي إلى ركن شديد. I wish that my back leans against something powerful. And the Prophet ﷺ, in his commentary on the ayah, he says, رحم الله أخي لوطا فقد كان يأوي إلى ركن شديد. May Allah have mercy on my brother Lut, for his back was leaning against the most powerful. But at that moment, in his fear, he did not see it. So you have to have that mental power in order to be able to push back and not let them erode your resilience so quickly, right? And then there is intellectual power. You have to be a problem solver. You have to produce solutions, intellectual solutions to the ongoing and prevailing problems in your society. That is intellectual power. You have to have an answer to the opioid epidemic. You have to have an answer to immigration problems. You have to have an answer to gun control, to the death penalty, to universal health care. As Muslims, we have to have solutions that are inspired by Islam. They don't have to be Islamic solutions, but they are solutions that are inspired by Islamic teachings, right? And then you have to have cultural power. So we need to be producing culture. In order to alter the culture, you have to produce culture. Otherwise, the prevailing culture will eat you up, right? We need to be producing poetry, and we need to be authoring books and stories that come out of our own traditions. We can't Some of our kids would like to fix cars and build bridges, and they want to become engineers. God bless them. That's their desire. Some of our other kids, they would like to become doctors, and they would like to go, help babies. I get that. But we cannot push everyone in the Muslim community to go into professional careers when they could be doing other things that are so important, that are so much needed. We need people that need to be in the arts. We need people that start writing movie scripts and theatrical performances and maybe cartoon movies and songs that become consumed by everyone and not just Muslims, right? This is how you achieve cultural power. And then after that, you have to have economic power. As I always say, we need to circulate money in our community 7 times before it leaks out. It needs to go back and forth 7 times in our community before we hire someone that is not Muslim, all right? And then physical power is your own personal physical power, physical strength, right? You taking care of your health, taking care of, going to the gym and lifting weights and taking your vitamins and avoiding junk food and avoiding sweets, right? And, the things that you need to do in order to stay active. And finally, military power. And military power may or may not apply to us. We're a civilian community that lives in the United States, but, other Muslim countries, in Pakistan, just the fact that they have, nuclear weapons just automatically puts them on the map. They cannot be ignored, right? In Tom Cruise's, most recent movie, Mission Impossible, they talk about Pakistan a lot in the movie. I don't want to mess up, destroy the movie for you, but they always talk about Pakistan. Why? Because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and that's what really matters, right? But as Muslims, as I said it repeatedly before, you also have to be familiar with, self-defense. You have to be familiar with firearms. You have to be familiar with archery. You have to be familiar with the things that you are constitutionally afforded, legally afforded in this country. 61, inshallah, we will end with this. After mustering the power, look at the order here, 60 and 61. 60 tells you, muster the power. And then 61 tells you, وَإِن جَنَحُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا. If they saw your strength and your power, and they decided to yield and to resort to peaceful methods, then reciprocate. Return in kind and say, okay, yeah, you want terms? I will accept your terms. You want to sit across the table from me? I will, because I don't want war. I don't want conflict. I don't want confrontation. I would rather actually get it resolved. So let's see. If they show a gesture of peace, then we will automatically do the same. And that lends itself to collaborations. It lends itself to treaties. It lends itself to working with other people and other communities, people who don't follow our faith, collaborate with them, towards common goals. We agree on social values. We can work together. We don't see other people, as a potential enemy at all. We would rather not, actually, as long as the purposes of Islam and the purposes of Sharia are met. They're not ignored. And as long as you're able to live peacefully and you're able to preach Islam and you're able to make da'wah and you're able to go to the mall and set up a table and invite people to the deen and distribute Qur'ans, and have your own channels and your own videos and your own podcasts freely, then you're okay. I would rather that I collaborate with people peacefully. There is no room for the usage of any coercive measures in an equation like this. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep it that way. But the thing is, it requires effort. It requires constant maintenance, because people of power, they always want to take it away from others, because power has to be concentrated. Power by its very nature needs to concentrate itself in the hands of the few. And it's only you that stands between them and what they want. It's to make sure that power is still somewhat, evenly distributed. Although, the way it is, unfortunately, in this country, is that power is gradually being concentrated in the hands of power and wealth are becoming this modern marriage that is unfortunately very, very, very unhealthy. So building alliances, working with others, towards common goals, agreeing on social values, collaborating, as long as the purposes of Sharia are fulfilled and maintained. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us strength and to unite our ranks. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our intentions. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our families and community. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in halal rizq. And I ask Allah azza wa jal to admit us all, inshallah ta'ala, in the highest level of Jannah. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah khair, inshallah. I will take some questions. Otherwise, we will pray in about 5 minutes. So if you guys want to get ready for Salat al-Dhuhr. So any questions going once? Yes.
Well, I wanted to ask Imam that, are you going to touch base at some point the concept about Malakat Imanakum, because that's also considered part of the
In Surah An-Nisa.
Surah An-Nisa.
Yes, inshallah.
Because it's a little confusing how it's explained. So I would like some
Yes.
clarity on that perspective as well.
This is important, inshallah. We're going to definitely get to that, yeah, extensively. And we're also going to talk about slavery a lot.
Yeah.
Yes, inshallah. Any questions?
I can ask them.
Please.
Okay, this is regarding riba. This is not, can I ask the question pertaining to a previous topic that we discussed, please?
I guess so. We still have a couple of minutes.
So my question is about the vintage market, where people sell stuff in a higher price based on their own, pricing range for vintage products or.
Their own assessment of the value. Mhm.
So is that like, or in other words, people, women buy these luxurious bags, LV bags, and all these luxurious items, and they sell those items later on as an investment higher than the market price.
Sure.
Because if it's a rare product that's not available in today's time, they're selling those collectible items, higher than the market price. Is that a part? Is that a form of riba?
No, it's not. No, it's not. Any type of buying and selling where the qualities of the product are clearly stated and disclosed to the seller, then it doesn't matter. You can impose your own price. If they don't like the price, they're not going to buy it. As long as you're not lying and you're not withholding any information. You want to sell your Chanel for $10,000 or Hermes for $25,000. I saw a sister that bought a used Hermes for $25,000. Like, dude, we could have made a couple of payments at the masjid with that. Do you really need $25,000 purse? But she says, I go to Umrah, I support people back home, I sponsor orphans, and I give the masjid $10,000 every year. I feel like I want to treat myself. But there, say again? I mean, I guess it's not up to us, I personally would not do that. I'm not opposed to wealth. I'm opposed to luxury. Like, it's okay to be a millionaire. It's okay to own property and stuff like that. But I don't know, like, if I would personally drive a Bentley because I can afford it, right? For me, like, I would probably refrain from that, but I can't say that it's haram either. I can't. That's not up to me, because it's not. But I want to go back to your point. If you take a gold necklace, like a 24-karat gold necklace that you bought 5 years ago, and you go to the jewelry store, and then you exchange that for a newer 24-karat gold necklace, and you pay $500 for the exchange, that is haram. Because that is the definition of riba. So you need to take your necklace, sell it, take the cash, and then go buy another one. Some scholars actually say that you should not do the two transactions at the same place, just to avoid the gray area completely. But when you buy an Hermes, 5 years ago, and then Hermes does not manufacture that product anymore, and now it becomes a vintage item. Men do that with Rolexes, right? A lot of people who buy Rolex, they buy because it actually gains value over time. But then you have to pay $75,000 for a freaking watch. It doesn't make any sense. But I suppose some people do that for investment purposes, and then they sell it and then buy another one. That is halal. That's not haram. It's not riba, at least, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, jazakallah khair. So let's wrap it up, inshallah, and we're going to pray dhuhr together. Subhanak Allahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim, wal asri, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu as-salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.